So we're on the 4th class of Healing Anxiety and Depression, which is a incredibly useful course, not just for anxiety and depression, but actually to be able to overcome all types of suffering and problems and really cultivate a sense of happiness and worth in our heart. So healing anxiety, depression, stress, unhappiness, the whole lot. And it's based on Buddhist psychology, which is very radical. And it really shows us what our potential can be, as well as what our problems are. And this particular class, we're going to have a look at anxiety, actually, and how it kind of reveals to us what actually matters to us, what our real instinctually held values are. Anxiety and depression, even though they're seen as common problems, from a Buddhist point of view, they're not the problem, they're the messenger. They're an indication something's wrong, but they aren't what's wrong with us. They're a symptom. So our main thing is to kind of have the courage to not try and just get rid of the symptom, but really use it to be able to heal ourselves. So I'm going to put up the screen share with the beginning of the slides, just as a way to help us through. So what we've already covered in the previous classes, to give you a bit of context, all of the Buddha's teachings are from the point of view of an understanding of the nature of our mind, the nature of our consciousness, our awareness. And from a Buddhist point of view, our nature is fundamentally pure and good. But within that, we have a whole lot of inner terrorists, all the, what I call the bullies, the disturbing emotions and afflicted states of mind. And we've gone through in detail a few of these just to see how they create havoc more than any external bully or a terrorist does. So in the first class, we looked at ignorance or confusion. Ignorance in particular about how to actually remove suffering and its causes. Because everything we've been doing in our life, we've been trying to do to just overcome problems and get happy, and how successful have we been at it? So it's because we don't know what to do, and we don't know what to do, or we pick the wrong things because we misunderstand who we are and what our potential is, and we grasp onto something that we're not. And of course, that's not going to turn out well. So we can remove the glasses. We can take off the hat, the hat of closed-mindedness and the glasses of confusion, so that we can see reality clearly. And that will help us completely overcome suffering. We've also looked at pride. So Professor Pride. Pride being a lot more than just being arrogant, but pride being that habit that we have of comparing ourselves to others, and how in that comparison, if we compare ourselves to others and it's quite favourable, we feel okay. You know, we feel we're on the upper portion, then we feel kind of puffed up about ourselves as if we're better people. If we compare ourselves to others and we find ourselves way down the bottom, then somehow we feel worthless and we get really demoralized. And both of them are out of step with reality. That need to compare and the need to have appreciation from others, from outside, to make us feel good is a real trap. So instead of actually developing some inner qualities that will help us and support us, and then naturally we'll have a sense of self-esteem and self-worth, we just try and get it from outside. And last week we looked at attachment, and so I've depicted, as you can see, the most wanted posters. So they're silly enough that you can remember them, but also they're most wanted, just like they're the inner criminals, the inner terrorists. They're the ones that cause us suffering, these distorted states of mind, thoughts, feelings, attitudes. And attachment's one of the worst. And attachment's very well disguised, because when attachment first arises, it feels good. It feels like a nice feeling. A really simple example, for instance, is when we feel anticipation. We're looking forward to something. So all we're doing is thinking about all the good qualities. And that's a good feeling, isn't it? We like anticipating something. So it appears good at first, and then later on the rest of the story comes. The object reveals its changeable nature. It turns into something else. It turns out to not be as good as we thought. Might have been a really gorgeous air hostess that travels with us all the time, but also might have been a terrorist, might be plotting and planning behind the scenes. So following attachment becomes a huge addiction, not the things themselves, but our distorted relationship with them. And it's likened to drinking salt water. We're so thirsty and we try and get satisfaction from outside of us, like drinking that salt water. And at first, it's cooling and it quenches our thirst. And later on, we're even more thirsty. So that kind of sets the scene. We did have some self-reflection sheets. I'm not sure if anyone has been doing the worksheets. I really hope that you are. The beauty of them is you can keep them private if you want to, and also they're quite short. So it's a way of getting started, because often when we're on this inner journey, especially at the beginning, we can feel quite overwhelmed and we just think, I'll never be able to do it. I'll never get there. But actually, it's just like the Loiny cartoon, How to Get There. You just take one step after the other and you walk down the path and you open the gate and you go out the gate and you walk along the street. And it's just little bit by little bit. So these worksheets are a way of doing that little bit by little bit. So for those of you who were here last week, does anyone have any questions about the worksheets or any reflections about them? You can do your lightning fingers and put them in the chat. Anything that was a surprise or anything that was confronting? It was mostly about the attachment, the distorted, kind of like looking at the world through rose-coloured glasses, how it's distorted. And because of that distortion, then when we see the rest of the story of how the thing isn't as good, or the person isn't perfect, or the device breaks, the suffering that comes from that is due to attachment. No questions or comments? Okay, let's have a look. I thought there was one, but also I may not quite be able to use the chat, but maybe you just decided to take it away again. Oh no, there it is. Right, Andrew. Yes, the course is centered on ignorance, pride and attachment, and I noticed the center of the Tibetan wheel of life has greed, anger and attachment at the center. Are these things meant to be the same? Yes, exactly, they are. So they are the drivers of this wheel of cyclic existence. And each one feeds into the other. You'll see that in the picture, that wheel of existence. And the whole wheel of existence is like being on this mortal coil, like the machinery of existence. It just drives us and drives us. And the whole 12 links and the wheel of existence is held in the mouth of this fierce-looking demon with huge vampire teeth and claws, and looks really terrifying. And what that is how impermanence looks to us when we're grasping at those things. It looks like a demon. But actually what we're going to see today is that demon, that impermanence, can be a good thing. It doesn't have to look like a demon, but our experience of it usually is. And the demon has these two fangs, and so their fangs are of the two truths. We are held by these two truths. But because we misunderstand it, we see impermanence and change as our enemy instead of our way out. Okay, so let's set our motivation. Just a short reflection, kind of a little meditation. So get comfortable. What we want is to have a balance between putting a bit of effort into having your posture straight, and so not kind of sprawled out on the chair, but just sitting up nice and straight, and then relaxing. So how to sit up straight, imagine a thread of light running through your body, from the base of your spine, up through your body and out the crown of your head. And feel this thread of light just being pulled upwards from your crown, so that all the weight of your body is supported. You'll naturally find that balance, not tipping forward or back or to the side. Take a deep breath in, let out all the stale air from the lungs, and let your shoulders drop. Let go of tension from the shoulders and the neck. Feel how you're supported by the chair or the couch, that stability of your posture. And also feel how the weight of your body is supported by this thread of light coming out your crown. And then bring your focus inwards, just resting your focus on the breath, breathing in, breathing out. So by just focusing on one thing, we can let all the busyness of the day begin to subside without following after any other thoughts as they arise. It's okay if they arise, but just putting them aside and bringing your focus back to the breath. And as you try and keep your focus on the breath, you might notice if your mind is predominantly busy tonight or if it's tired. So just noticing and naming without worrying about it, and then keeping your focus on the breath. Just becoming aware of that inner environment, just like a snapshot, how it is tonight. Often our mind is like a very busy airport or a busy mall, and our mindfulness is like the poor old security guard tasked of keeping an eye on everything. Have we trained our security guard? Do we feel supported? How is our mindfulness? Are we able to spot which are the disturbing emotions, which are the positive ones? Are we able to slow things down when we wish, focus when we wish? So as you keep your focus on the breath, you'll notice there is the awareness as well as what's going on in the mind. You are not reducible to any one thought or feeling, even though it may feel like it overwhelms you entirely. All of those experiences happen within the spaciousness of the mind. So recognizing how we all yearn for peace and calm and safety, And yet so often our minds are distracted or full of fear or boredom or dissatisfaction. This is what we have in common with everybody. So for our motivation, our purpose for being here tonight, we can think the benefit that we receive can be really helpful for us, but it can go much further than that. That by working on our own mind, we can benefit others. We can create harmony around us. We can help others. And definitely we can stop harming them. And that is a profound way to help the world, to help all the beings in the world. And in the process, we ourselves will become happier, calmer, kinder human beings. So what a great thing to look forward to. So with this motivation, then take a nice deep breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. Open your eyes if they're closed. So let's have a look what topics we'll be covering tonight in particular. We're looking at how to listen to the wisdom in your anxiety. So anxiety, it's out of step with reality, so it's a suffering kind of experience, but there is wisdom in there. Our job is to be able to tell what the difference between anxiety and legitimate fear is, because there is a difference and there's a reason for that. And then how we can actually heed the message, what anxiety and fear are telling us. And in amongst all of this are some really common misconceptions that we have about the causes of our problems. And because we labor under these misconceptions, then even if we put in a huge amount of effort and energy, because it's based on a mistake, we're not going to get the results that we want. It really compounds our unhappiness and our problems. This is a real tragedy. So we're going to look at the misconceptions. And I found that incredibly useful for me because I could spot I was doing all of them. And we're going to have a look at some really simple, easy techniques how to break the habit of worry. So worry or anxiety, there's a spectrum, isn't there, from just worrying or fretting to anxiousness, social anxiety, all the way to just full-blown dread when it escalates. And we can have just acute attacks of anxiety, or it can be a general malaise of feeling just twitchy or uncomfortable in our skin. A general kind of go-to being worried attitude. So we'll be able to have a look at what the really deep causes are and what we can do about it. So stick with me. To put things into perspective, the causes of both anxiety and depression, even though they're quite different feelings, they have very similar causes. Now, quite a few years ago, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he was in Brisbane, gave a public talk. Maybe some of you even went. And at the end, there were questions from the audience, and someone asked His Holiness, what's the cure for depression? What's the cure for anxiety? And he gave a very interesting answer. And basically, the answer is that there is no one cure. It's different from, say, attachment or from pride or from ignorance, which are universal experiences, and they have universal antidotes. We can recognize the problem, and we can put in the antidote, and we can become free of them. But depression and anxiety have multiple causes, and because they have multiple causes, there's no one cure. They have to have multiple cures. So if we want to become free of depression and anxiety, we have to be able to trace it through to what the cause is. Otherwise, we can be treating it in one way, and if that isn't the cause of it for us, it's wasted energy. And the answer that His Holiness gave was fantastic, because it started with the most obvious, most easy and basic, and you try those. And then as you progress through, then you try the next thing and then the next thing. So many times we might start at the most subtle and try and work at that, whereas actually it could have been something really, really simple. So here we go. One of the classic causes of depression or anxiety is things like, it's organic. Changes in brain chemistry, environment, diet, or an acquired brain injury. So I've put cans of soft drink here, because if you sat down and had those 3 cans of soft drink, you'd have a sugar rush, you'd feel fantastic, and then what happens? Boom, sugar crash, isn't it? And then it's really difficult to recover from that. And if we believe that, if we believe our emotional experience from that, our life is going to be a roller coaster. There was a judge in England for a while there that in the juvenile court didn't hand out incarceration sentences, but handed out diets, and got the teenage kids to actually change their diet from fast food and soft drinks and how many kilos of sugar a week to some better forms of sugar and some nutritious food. And that just changed everything. It was a revelation. Okay. So, participants raise their hands. Anything to put into the chat? No. I don't know how to unraise your hand or anything like that. So let's see. No? No, okie dokie. The other thing about the changes in brain chemistry, the organic changes, it can just come from high blood pressure. So with anxiety, my father, who had a job for many years as a trumpeter in the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and you know, he was in the orchestra for several decades, and in the last few years, he said he started getting stage fright. He was completely perplexed. How come? What's going on? And so he went straight to deep psychological investigation of what kind of Jungian thing from his past is coming up and all of this, and did all this work, which undoubtedly was quite useful, but he still had stage fright. And then eventually his wife convinced him to go to the doctor, and all of his feelings of fear, anxiety and anxiousness and stage fright was to do with having high blood pressure. It was just as simple as that. So to save ourselves a huge amount of trauma and effort. Also, if you have sleep apnea, if you don't get enough sleep, that in itself, that continuous tiredness can lead to a really deflated feeling of depression. Brain damage also, changes in brain chemistry or acquired brain injury, or things like hormonal changes. Used to be called the baby blues, postnatal depression, where your hormonal changes in your body are so overwhelming that it changes how you feel even about you know, the newest member of your family, and then a huge amount of guilt comes in on top of that. So a lot of that is organic. It's a physical cause, and we have to deal with that physical cause first. Then the next level, okay, so we've looked at all the physical things, no, everything's fine there. So then it could be that it's a response to events. So if you have sleep apnea, if you don't get enough sleep, that in itself, that continuous tiredness can lead to a really deflated feeling of depression. difficult situations. If we live in a home where there's family violence or aggression that is going to keep us on edge, then it's a natural response. Feelings of helplessness. So if just recently you've lost your job or you don't know how you're going to pay the mortgage, that kind of experience is that we can identify it as a response to events. When there's a death in the family, when something, some event happens that's quite traumatic, when there's a war, when there's a natural disaster, when there is a pandemic, we can kind of identify that it's a response to that. And in a way, being able to identify that is a bit of a relief, because we kind of know, oh, it's not me, it's the thing out there. So it gives us a little bit of comfort. The problem, of course, comes is that we may be responding to events that we can't pinpoint. The other thing that happens is that in our culture, it depends how long we get to overcome these events. So, for instance, the death of a loved one. When I was growing up in Fitzroy, there was a whole lot of Greek and Italian widows, and so when their husbands died from whatever war, revolution, they wore black for the rest of their life. The older ones from the Second World War, they just dyed everything black. The younger ones, they wore black for a year, or they wore a black armband. So you had a minimum of a year to go into mourning, to be kind to yourself, to give yourself a bit of space, and for other people also to know. Then in the big psychological manual, psychiatric manual about all the different mental illnesses and problems, for a long time was you got 8 weeks to be in mourning about somebody. You have 8 weeks to grieve, and then after that it was decided it's time to get it together now. You should be over it. And just a few years ago, they changed it to 2 weeks. You have 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, then it's medicalised. Then it's seen as grieving for somebody is now a problem. And you need drugs. So really, this is a contextual thing. It's a cultural thing. Then also, our experience of depression and anxiety is powered by destructive habit patterns. It's a learned behaviour. How we think, or how Corey Jackson calls it, poor mental hygiene. And basically what this means is if something really traumatic did happen to us, for instance, when we were little, we have such a strong response to that. The next time something similar happens, we have a similar response. So for instance, if you were actually neglected as a child, then if you have an appointment to go and see somebody, or you're going to meet them for coffee and they don't show up, it's going to be really traumatic. But why? Because everything from when we're a child comes back up. We respond in exactly the same way that we did beforehand, and we forget. We're a grown-up. We have so much more wisdom and experience. We have people that we can rely on. We have a wealth of self-help information at our fingertips, but we forget, and we just propelled back into being that neglected 7-year-old. And see, if we respond like that in a situation, then the next time someone stands us up for coffee, it's much more likely we'll respond in that way again and again and again, until it becomes a behaviour that it's the only way that we know in our whole life, and we're completely out of date with ourselves. So this is a real tragedy, that by engaging in these responses, it's like we're practicing depression, we're practicing anxiety, and they become our default mechanism. But there is something we can do about that. And of course, the last one, the afflictive emotions. All of our distorted attitudes, our those internal bullies, attachment, pride, jealousy, possessiveness, craving, the negative ones of aversion, blame, resentment, revenge, all of those afflicted, distorted states of mind that drive us result in depression and anxiety. So one way we can look at this is we can go, do I have depression or anxiety? Yes, therefore I have afflictive emotions. They're the cause of it. So instead of trying to get rid of just depression and anxiety, we've got to find out which of the afflictive emotions are the ones that are driving me to this experience. And some of them might be more prevalent than others. So for instance, if you grew up in a household, one lady who was coming here, she had all these brothers, she was the only girl, and in her household she was told girls can't do anything. So she had this really low self-esteem and this yearning for appreciation with others. And that's all tied up in pride, identity, high arrogance and low self-esteem. That's all tied up in that one package of the afflictive emotions, of grasping at an identity that doesn't exist that way and craving for the recognition of others, and yet it doesn't make us feel better. So that was her main trigger, the main afflictive emotion. It might just be that we're riven with craving. And I can remember being incredibly depressed and also angry that I didn't want the world to be the way it was, and yet it was, and I just could not bear it, and I just blamed the world, society, this bunch of politics, that bunch of men or that bunch of women, and it got stronger and stronger. My depression got stronger and stronger. So that kind of went through this real aversion and hatred and impatience. So you'll be able to see where you can trace it down through the trajectory. Now, has anyone put anything in the chat? Do we have any questions? We have a... No? No one can write anything? So the other thing to keep in mind that our physical state, all those organic changes in the brain, affect how we feel, and it affects and can trigger our emotional states. And our emotional states then also affect how our brain is wired. It's a two-way street. And this is actually really good because it means we can do something about it. Even if our brain at the moment is hardwired for anxiety or depression, and tonight's topic, anxiety, it doesn't mean that that's it, there's nothing we can do. It's just wired wrong. There's always something that we can do, because the way, if we change how we think, if we change our emotional response using our mind, that will actually rewire the brain. So let's have a look at the difference then between anxiety and fear. This amazing illustration from a Sean Tan book, because there is a difference between anxiety and fear. Both of them are unpleasant, but they're quite different things. So fear, it can actually accurately reflect a situation. You know, if there was a Dharma centre when I lived in Melbourne, in East Brighton, and if you got there by public transport, you had to walk along and cross this incredible junction. There were 12 different roads feeding into it. Some of them were a 6-lane highway. Some of them were little turning ones. It was just epic to get from one side to the other. It was about 6 sets of traffic lights. And I was going to this Dharma centre with my friend who was blind, and I was just thinking, I don't know how on earth he could ever negotiate this without a friend. And I was fearful of just, you had to really keep your wits about you. So fear is a good thing. It's not pleasant, but if you were just kind of lackadaisical, she'll be right, mate, one of those sets of traffic lights, it wasn't going to be right. So we need it. We need fear. Anxiety, though, when we look at anxiety, how we usually recognize it is that it's out of step with reality. We see it, it's an out of proportion response to something that we don't like, a situation that we see as negative or bad or distasteful or that is a problem. So there's some things about this, and actually it's quite interesting because, for instance, even something far more intense like post-traumatic stress, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, actually could be called PTSR, post-traumatic stress response. Because actually this traumatic response, this heightened response, is a response to something that happened in the past. In the past, it wasn't out of step with reality. In the past, it was actually directly proportionate to how fearful the situation was. But because it's so intense, it gets hardwired in our brain. And then we come back to a situation where there isn't anything overtly threatening us, but we're so ready, we have that same response. So there's some things about anxiety to really remember. One of them is that fighting anxiety makes it stronger. So if anxiety arises, or social anxiety, stress, any of those things, when it arises, usually we just go, oh, I don't want it, and we try and push it away. And that's the worst thing to do because it makes it stronger. It brings it to our focus. We almost become tunnel vision about it. It's really ironic, isn't it? So fighting the anxiety, wanting it to go away, going, no, 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 not happening, not happening. What are we looking at now? Just 100% anxiety. So that's not the way to get rid of it. We can get rid of it, but not by fighting it, not by wishing it would not be there and go away. It's fueled by the habit, the force of habit, which can be very intense even with the post-traumatic stress because it is hardwired into our nervous system. It's totally unbidden. It also can result in us, okay, so yeah, fighting it makes it stronger. It's fueled by habit. It actually stems all the way back to grasping at a fictional identity. This me that is afraid or threatened. So that grasping at who we are, really thinking, having that incredibly intense feeling of who we are and grasping at it actually causes the fear. And usually this feeling of who we are is very separate from others. There's a duality there, self and others. And others are a threat. It becomes a vicious feedback loop, actually. So it's a fictional thing. It's out of step with reality. And we trace that one all the way back to that fundamental ignorance of not understanding how we exist as a human being, what our nature is, and how so much of it is in flux and depends on the context. So people who've been away at war, in that context, human beings that you don't know are the enemy. Then you come back to a peaceful society and human beings who you don't know, you're just trained to see them as the enemy. So it forgets that that duality between self and others is incredibly strong, and we forget everything that we have in common. And of course, the result, we feel alone, threatened, powerless, all of those things. We panic. We panic and all of our emotions run away with us. So we kind of relate to that. There's varying degrees of scale, but I'm sure we all relate to it. And then we become ruled by fear. Constantly feel under threat. So I'm just going to stop the screen share for a moment to see if I've missed any Questions? Yes, so I just can't seem to see the chat anyway. So the questions. The organic results, yeah, when the cordial is taken out of youth detention centre. Yes, yes, yes. Can karma cause depression and anxiety? Well, this is how the kind of the mechanics of it, Andrew. So generally in this course, I don't mention karma as such because I'm trying to use not the Buddhist terms, but something that is more suited to our Western temperament. And also, if you're not a Buddhist, for instance, if you're Christian, then karma isn't kind of going to make sense. But in terms of karma, understanding it as a psychological cause and effect, then yes, karma causes depression and anxiety. So our habitual familiarity, especially with the disturbing emotions, results in depression and anxiety. And then normally what happens, we blame everyone and everything out there, which are just triggers. They can never be the cause because it's we who are experiencing it. So it's we who have to change our mind. It's in our mind. It's not happening out there. So yeah, the teachings on karma can be very useful for this because again, it turns our focus inwards to look for the solution. So I'm not belittling what happens outside of us, but what happens outside of us usually are the things that we blame, and they can never be the root cause. They're triggers. So our common terminology calls them, I'm triggered by this or trigger warning that. But where is the experience happening? It's happening in my mind. And why is my mind primed for anxiety or primed for depression? Because of everything that I've done and said and how I've interacted with others in the past. Yes, so karma and afflictive emotions, yes. It's the afflictive emotions that drive us to act. And when we act, there are consequences. And usually those consequences are a big surprise. Okay. What else? Rightio. Now, let's have a look at the misconceptions about things. Now, this is the really juicy bit. Did I have a thing to read? Okay, so how we get things wrong, and because we have these misconceptions, then it compounds everything. So one of the misconceptions, these come from the Four Noble Truths, the teachings from the First Noble Truth. So one of our misconceptions, we assume that things, people, and relationships don't change. And when they do, we're really surprised. You know, when the object breaks, you know, if you're in the kitchen and you drop something, no one ever says, oh yes, they say, oh no. But I think we talked about this last week, isn't it? It's the only possible end result of a cup, of a glass, of a bottle, is to be smashed. But instinctually, when we drop them and we smash them, we say, oh no. We don't go, yes. When something wears out, we get upset about it. When a relationship ends, we think there's something wrong there. I remember when David Bowie died. You know, everyone's like, how could David Bowie die? He's David Bowie. Of course it's crazy, but that's our instinctual response is no. Special people can't. Really good, famous people can't. So it's because our intellect is out of step with our instincts, our instinctual grasping at permanence. And this traces right back to that fundamental ignorance again. So we have this assumption that things won't change, and when they do, we go, oh, why can't it go back to how it used to be? We get really upset. Things change, like the coronavirus comes upon us and everything changes, and it's a real shock. And we think that's an aberration. We want things to go back to normal, but things were never normal. Things were always changing. Coronavirus just revealed that truth to us. It didn't change things. Things are always changing. So because we grasp at that permanence, then when they change, we suffer. We're just not prepared. Especially when it comes to relationships or people dying, it's so incredibly distressing because we just don't think it's going to happen. So we have this misconception, whereas actually things are impermanent. That's their nature. They are impermanent. The second one, we think that things will bring us lasting happiness. We think that they'll bring us just happiness, you know, and it'll be lasting. This'll be the one. This'll be the relationship. This is the one. This time it'll work. This is the job that'll work out. I just got a good feeling about it. This is the horse that's gonna win. But you know, if you're a collector, for instance, or you may not have started off being a collector, you might have just got, like I saw a documentary about these guys collecting sneakers, Nikes and things. You know, so they got a nice pair of Nikes and they really liked it. So they thought, okay, if I just get, maybe I'll get 2. Maybe I'll get one of each color, collect the whole set. But each time you're not getting more satisfied, are you? Each time you need more. So the happiness that it brings isn't lasting. It wears off. It's what's called temporal happiness. It changes. It wears off, or it turns into its opposite. Now we don't like that anymore. Now someone else has a better one, and now suddenly ours doesn't look so good. It's suddenly changed. So there's a whole spectrum here, from just boredom to being really dissatisfied and craving. And the problem is, not in those things. There's nothing wrong with all those sneakers. There's nothing wrong in relationships. But the problem is this expectation that they'll bring us everlasting happiness. So the Buddhist term is to recognize that things are actually in the nature of misery, not in the nature of happiness. If they were in the nature of happiness, we'd just be able to have one relationship and that's it, done, I'm happy. So it doesn't mean that we have to stop looking for lasting happiness. Please don't think that. But we've got to look where it can be found, and it cannot be found in those things because they don't last. They change, they break and wear out. Then we have a couple of other assumptions. So one, we have this assumption that things should work, that they should be pure or perfect. So when we get a new device, for instance, we expect it to work. When we have a photocopier, we expect it to work. And when it doesn't, we use that word, but it should work. It should be right. There's something wrong here. But actually, you know, anything that's a mechanical thing is going to break, is going to fail in some way because it just wears out. Anything that's invented by a human being, if the human being isn't perfect, the thing isn't perfect. It's going to have, it's going to get viruses, and it's going to need whatever software on it. Human beings aren't perfect, and yet we expect perfect relationships. We really expect our partner to be a majority good person. We expect them to always look out for us, to always be on our side, to have exactly the same tastes as us, to be perfect in all of their behavior. We may not expect that from us, but we definitely expect it from the other. And the proof of the pudding is that when they just act badly just once, we just find it unbearable. It's such a betrayal. It's a really big thing to get over. So instead of recognizing, kind of being realistic, you know, this person isn't perfect, so of course they're going to stuff up and make mistakes. Do I still care about them? Do I still wish them happiness? Do we still have a constructive relationship? But while we kind of grasp and hope for that person to be perfect, then instead of even enjoying what's there, we're just going to be constantly disappointed. In terms of things, we have this thought, oh, it's a nice car, but it's really hard to get parts. And we think that the hard to get parts part is an aberration from the nice car. Or I want a really gorgeous house, and I'll fill it all up with white furniture like you see on all the TV shows. And then it's like, oh, dang, it's really hard to clean. So we kind of think we're disjointed about it. The two things come together. An all white house comes together with a huge amount of cleaning. It's not an aberration. So when we have our obsessions for things, always looking for the better one, the most perfect one, is this like chasing a mirage? Are we going to be constantly disappointed and then heartbroken and then thrown into this downward spiral? Or are we going to be constantly worried about what if it breaks? What if it goes wrong? Where actually it's natural that it will. And the last one, that this is a bit tricky, this one, that things, we assume, we have a misconception that things have a real findable essence. So when we think of ourselves, usually we think our body. If someone hits me, you know, they've hit me. Actually, they've hit my body. We have this sense of identity of who we are. And we looked at that on the Pride class. But actually, if we investigate who are we really, what we are, we're very reactionary. We just react to whatever's happening to us. There's very little that what we do actually comes from within that isn't triggered by something, by a pleasant thing or an unpleasant thing. So we're a collection of reactions to circumstances. And yet we feel this is me. We have this really strong sense of me. It may not be strong kind of all the time, but the moment we're threatened, there it is. The moment someone misunderstands us, we can't bear it. The moment someone's mean to us, we can't bear it. So we have this really strong sense of me, and we think that's the real me. And when we have anxiety and depression, we think that's the real me as well, and we cling to it. Whereas actually, when we look at who we are, it's far more flexible. You know, who we are is this whole combination of our circumstances, of whether we have a job or not at the moment with coronavirus. Here we are thinking there was this real essence of me, and yet whether we still have our job, whether we're going to work or whether we're staying at home, has profoundly changed how we think and feel about ourselves. Oh, Andrew, so the discussion about the nature of things makes me start to worry that the secret to happiness is to have low expectations. Oh yeah, so this one we talked about last week actually. So being free of attachment or expectations does not mean flatlining or becoming bland. Actually, the expectations and the projections is what creates the suffering, the disappointment, and it blinds us to what's there, to what the potential is. It blinds us to growth. So the opposite of these misconceptions is actual freedom and joyousness and energy, not flatlining. Doesn't mean, okay, I'm just going to have no expectations at all. We just got to look in the right place. So we can look for perfection, but we're not finding it in those things that depend on causes and conditions. We can have lasting happiness, but we're not going to get it from somebody else, because it has to be experienced in our mind. And things, relationships, everything changes. Thank goodness, because that means my depression can change, and my anxiety can change, and my stress can change. But what we're looking is to change those things out there. And grasping at this thought, this is the real me, means that we grasp onto all of our problems as the real me. And we have a huge amount of anxiety too, that, you know, so many people have an anxiety about aging, for instance, that they're going to get old and age, and then somehow that makes us worse, instead of, hey, it's fantastic, we've managed to live this long. We think we're a body, and as our body disintegrates, we think we are disintegrating. So there's a lot of anxiety that comes from that. We think that our worth comes from our looks. There's a lot of anxiety that comes from that. We don't want things to change, and there's so much anxiety and fear that comes from that. So it comes from grasping at this real findable essence where it actually cannot be found. And that's out of step with reality. And because it's out of step with reality, it creates misery. Once we become more in step with reality, we'll become more joyous, just naturally. So you don't have to worry. But we'll see why in a moment. So here we get to stress. Stress can be a good thing. What? You know, I can remember thinking, oh, I'm always so stressed, I'm always so behind on all my lung return percenter jobs. I know I need something less stressful to do. But actually, we can try and chase a less stressful job, quit that one, go and find another one, but somehow that becomes stressful too. So one of the things I discovered about stress is that reducing stress isn't about changing that job out there, it's about changing our attitude. Because I just bring my stress to everything. And I bring my stress because of those misconceptions. For instance, that I'll be able to be perfect in everything that I do. So with Lung Retumper Centre, you know, the stress of having this huge amount of work to do, and hardly any of it gets done, gets accomplished. And actually, there isn't going to be a one day when it's perfect, because the stress, the job will be finished when all sentient beings are enlightened, are liberated from samsara, from cyclic existence, and enlightened. And until then, I have a to-do list. So I just got to give up on that idea of the perfection coming from out there and look at my level of stress. And stress is this experience with all of those misconceptions that's driving it. But we think we'll fix our stress from out there. So that's one thing. The other thing is that stress, believe it or not, it's not pleasant, but it's essential. How come? How come I put a picture of an astronaut? Well, because human beings, we need stress to grow and develop. So with these astronauts, you know, they go off into space, and here they are floating around, and, you know, they don't have to drag themselves out of bed. They just float along, up and at 'em. How excellent is that? Heaps of fun. But then recently, you know, when the astronauts came back from outer space, did you see they carried them out? So they arrived back on the Earth. They didn't walk along with everybody to the great big welcome back ceremony. They carried them in a chair. It took 6 people to carry each person with the chair. They carried the astronauts. That wasn't like a chair of a welcoming homecoming. That's because all of their muscles had degenerated and they had no strength. They were completely weak. They could not lift their arms up. They couldn't lift their head up. They had to be carried out. So this is what happens. If you don't have the stress of gravity to push against, if you have no stress, your muscles aren't worked and they just atrophy. All the time that we're walking around, we're fighting against gravity, and that makes us strong. That means that we have bone density and we have strength in our muscles. So we have this idea, oh, it'd be great to just float around and not have to do anything. But actually, the whole time, it's great that we have that stress, because that means we're strong. Now, let's have a look at the chat. I shouldn't stress, I know, but see, here comes the next thing. Stress, why it can be useful. Because we have this idea, it's a cognitive fusion, it's called, where we mix these two things together. It feels bad, therefore it is bad. And actually, instinctually, we don't even separate out the two. Something feels bad, we don't want it because it must be bad. Something feels good, it must be good. That's cognitive fusion. So floating around as an astronaut feels great, must be great. But it's not necessarily great. And I've found that with stress or a little bit of worry or a little bit of anxiety and a little bit of adrenaline is very useful, because it helps me focus. So I often tell you this story about when I first started leading classes and I was terrified. Public speaking, utterly terrified. But, you know, so many people have asked questions and there's such need for help. And I've done a bit of research and I have something to share. If it's going to help people, then I'm going to do it, even if I am terrified of public speaking. So one of the things that I figured out was to just give up the idea of ever enjoying class. I just went, okay, torture Tuesdays. That's it. That's my life now forever. I'm just going to have torture Tuesdays. I'm going to be terrified all day, and then I'll lead a class and then phew at the end of the class. But what it did was the adrenaline meant that I focused, and it meant that I studied and I found sources and things to read to you and quotes. And if I didn't have that, I would have been totally lazy. So there is, and many performers will say this, that you need a bit of stress and adrenaline before the performance to focus you. And if you don't have it, you have a real lackadaisical kind of flat performance. So cognitive fusion makes us panic and makes us think, oh, this is a terrible feeling, it's a torture, I don't want it. Whereas you go, yep, it's a terrible feeling, but it's not necessarily terrible. There's a really big difference, and it can be incredibly useful. And just like crossing all of those roads on that junction there of the 12 different roads, terrible feeling, but that fear makes you tunnel vision. And that makes you focus. And so you're just focusing on the road. You're not thinking about whether your stomach's hanging out and you're looking a bit fat. You're not thinking about, is your phone ringing? You're not thinking about, is my hat blowing off and chasing the hat into the traffic. You're just focusing on staying safe. So it's really important. So here we are. Feelings are not facts. So the feeling it's a valid feeling. I'm not saying that's not happening or it's wrong, but it is just a feeling and it's not a fact. It's not true. So you have this feeling, anxiety, and anxiety tells you a story, and that's a valid, horrible feeling, but it's not true. The story it's telling you is not true. So it just puts a little bit of separation in there without diminishing what you're going through. So resilience is the ability to voluntarily bear suffering by keeping the mind calm. Resilience is a big catchword. How do we actually develop resilience? It's not from avoiding problems. We need problems, just like we need gravity to push against to make us strong. We need problems to develop resilience. So there's another thing that happens that I've noticed too, that say for instance with a death in the family or trying to avoid really traumatic things, if you go through your life without any of those traumatic things, one of my friends got to her early 30s without ever having anyone close to her die. So you might think that's great. And if you're young and somebody close to you does die, it leaves a scar. It is traumatic. But if you get to 30 years old and then your pet dies and you've never experienced loss like that visceral loss, you have no resilience. So my friend basically had a meltdown, had a nervous breakdown from her pet dying. And you might go, oh, get over it, it's just a pet. But this was her first experience of loss, and it was a profound loss. And she had no way to cope with it because she hadn't had any little mini losses all the way leading up. So I remember when my cat died when I was like 4 or 5, and I remember being so upset for months and months. I cried every night. I was just devastated. And I remember that collapsed feeling in your heart of grieving. And that was a terrible thing to go through. But because you do live through it, you do go through it, and then you slowly get stronger and stronger. And so with other losses, it hasn't been as bad. In a few years ago in the Kinslake fires, the bushfires down in Victoria, and now we've had a whole nother spate of fires. It'd be really interesting to see what happened. But the Kinslake fires, this huge community destroyed and many people died. And so they were the authorities particularly concerned about what's happening to all the kids in the community and looking after them. And there was a study done where they found that the kids that came from what you'd think homes that had more problems, so maybe single parent or moved around a lot or poor, without the same opportunities, lots of things stacked against you, those kids ended up being much more resilient and bouncing back and being far less traumatized by the fires. And the kids that came from really stable, comfortable homes with no problems, no dysfunctional relationships, they were the ones that had long-term lasting trauma. So here we are, we're trying to grow up our kids and shield them from every single problem we possibly can. And it's really doing them a disservice. Life is changeable, it is difficult. All of these things come at us like coronavirus out of left field and we don't see it coming. The people who cope the best are the ones that have already had stresses and coped with it. And the ones that haven't, if this is your first time ever that you're deprived of your liberty, I'm sure there's a huge amount of people that are having nervous breakdowns right now because it's the first time that they can't go out and distract themselves. So the intermittent stress is what we need, not continuous stress. It's just like with weight training. You need stress and then rest. And with stress to do with problems, we need something that's a challenge, and then we need safety. And then a challenge, and then safety. But we kind of think, oh, if I could just get everything safe, and no challenges, that'll be the best. But it's a mistake. So I have a nice thing to read to you from this great book, The Perfect Mirror, Venerable Gyatso, Thupten Gyatso, Adrian Feldman, Australian monk. And you can get this as a ebook, I think. Anyway, this is what he says. Instead of being obstacles to happiness, the things that go wrong in life, which we usually react to with sadness, anxiety, or anger, can become sources of happiness. The key to this magical transformation is knowing that just as rain is a curse for picnickers but a blessing for farmers, it is our self-oriented outlook that determines whether something is a problem or not. If we always react to difficulties with self-centered aversion and continue to blame the external world for our troubles, things will always appear to be against us, and we will never be free from sadness, anxiety, and anger. To not be disturbed by problems, we must first reject the attitude of not wanting things to go wrong. I'll read that again because it's amazing. It blew my mind. To not be disturbed by problems, we must first reject the attitude of not wanting things to go wrong. We have to abandon our aversion to suffering by recognizing that things are always going wrong, and it is useless to be unhappy when they do so. If the problem can be fixed, we do not need to be sad. And if the problem cannot be fixed, being sad cannot help. It only rubs salt into the wound. So this is what I found helped me with my Torture Tuesdays, that I just gave up on the thought of trying to fix that feeling of fear. And I thought about the people in the class. I thought, Miffi, just suck it up, you know. If you're terrified, it doesn't matter. It's not the point. The point is the people in the class. So it got me out of this kind of collapsing into my own black hole and thinking about others. And that really helped me. And so now you'd be happy to hear, I love Tuesdays. It's the highlight of my week. But it took a long time. Like, I've been leading this course for about 15 years, and it took a long time to me to get to a neutral stage and then to actually enjoy it. And the way out of it was by thinking about you, your benefit. So he goes on, we need to abandon aversion to problems because fear and anxiety only increase harm by sapping us of our courage. Aversion to things going wrong is the root of our anxiety. To overcome anxiety and to derive happiness from our problems, we should now cultivate the attitude of being happy when problems arise. Problems should be seen as useful because they give us opportunities to train our mind in consideration for others and in abandoning selfishness. We need not go to the extreme of seeking problems through ascetic practices. Problems will always find us. So when they do, we can deal with them in many skillful ways. So this is like with the coronavirus, isn't it? There's some people have managed to really turn this situation into bringing forth their own creativity, to changing their life, to getting rid of all of the distractions. It's really had it's become an opportunity, hasn't it? Now, lots of comments. Oh, the book. So the book is called The Perfect Mirror by Adrian Feldman. Thanks, Nat. Hope to see you next time. So Shanti Dover says, if you can do something about the situation, what's the point of worrying? If you cannot do anything, there's no point worrying. So there's a graphic here. I love this one because, you know, it sets it out really clearly. And someone else that you may recognize, don't worry, be happy. It's all the same message, isn't it? And my Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's looked after me so well throughout just about all of my life. You know, every time I'd see Rinpoche, he'd say, Miffi, don't you worry. And I go, oh, I know, but I can't help it. So just having someone say to me, you don't have to worry, eventually, after many years, I started getting it. I could still think about the situation, but I don't have to worry about it. The worry, the anxiety, the fear, what if it changes? What if something goes wrong? All those what ifs, they are going to happen. So we don't have to stress about that. But you can still think about the situation and plan what we can do about it. And we can get to a stage of actually embracing difficulties. So when the coronavirus lockdown happened, for a couple of years now, I've been thinking I really wanted to get Langri Thampa Center classes online, and it just never happened. And when this lockdown happened, I just knew this is the moment. This is the best thing that ever happened to Langri Thampa Center. This way we can benefit so many more people. So we'll put a huge amount of energy into this long-term view. From now on, we're going to have online classes. We'll be able to open up eventually one day live, but we're going to continue the online classes. So there you go. That's turning a problem into happiness. Not saying it wasn't difficult. Not saying I wasn't totally sleep deprived. Everyone else having Corona holiday, I was really sleep deprived. But you can see it's not kind of being in denial. The lockdown is really challenging, and it's very challenging for people to do online classes, but it can be turned into something else, can't it? And so many people have said, oh, Miffi, you're going to keep on having online classes. Yes, no matter what it takes, of course we will. Yes, and that's right, climate change. So the world has benefited from the industry shutting down. It showed just in a few short weeks the skies can clear. It is possible to do something about climate change. There's the proof. That's right. So you can see it's our attitude, and what trips us up is this aversion to the feeling, just not wanting that feeling of anxiety or not wanting that feeling of trauma. And then we miss out on all of this potential. So let's have a look how to break the habit of worry. I hope we get through all of this in time. How to listen to your anxiety and hear the wisdom in your anxiety. So in no particular order, but some handy hints for you. So mindfulness, to become aware if you're stressing, if you're feeling anxious, and instead of trying to get rid of it, just notice and name. Become aware of how you're feeling the sensations in your body. Become aware of how you're feeling the sensations in your mind, and describe it. Describe where you feel it in the body. Does it feel large or small, or tight or fast or slow? All of those things to notice and name. So this is very useful on so many levels. So one way, when we do that, immediately we are not identified with the anxiety anymore. So we get the result that we want. But we don't get it by going, no, I don't want the anxiety. You go, here comes the terror. Here comes the fear. It feels like this. My blood pressure's gone up. I'm feeling tight and constricted, or I can feel it in my shoulders. How interesting. That's the first thing to do. And it can actually stop the whole chain reaction. The other thing is to change your breathing pattern. So this is going right to the organic causes. When we get nervous and anxious, we start breathing just from the top of our lungs very fast. So the way to stop that is with your breathing, to breathe, have your out breath longer than your in breath. So you can count. You can count out for 4, in for 2. Out for 4, in for 2. And count it out loud. That will change everything. Physiologically, when your nervous system backs down again, then your emotions are likely to follow, and then the mind can follow. So, you know, we use whatever we can, but it's the way to stop a panic attack. The other thing is to change the environment, so that when it's already happening, when we're already anxious and stressed and worried, just going and seeing a view, just putting on music that you love, or just getting up and going and sitting in another room. So what you're doing is physically you're changing the context, because what anxiety and worry does, it's tunnel vision. So you get completely focused onto one thing to the extent that you can't move. And you can't force yourself out of that. It just won't work. So how you can do it, you can kind of preempt it by changing the context. And when you change the context, then you change your response. So if somebody that you know is having a panic attack or really anxious or frightened, one of the best things is to grab them by the arm and go for a walk. Don't sit down and have coffee and talk about it. It's the worst thing to do. The coffee will just make it worse, and you'll get more and more tight into that one spot. But to move and to get everything working, to go on a walk, and the type of thinking you do is completely different when you're walking. So change of environment, really quite profound. Physical exercise, so they say all sorts of, physical exercise, you release all endorphins and stuff. Well, I wouldn't know about that because every day I think I should do some exercise, and then I'm just too tired. And now that we're all online, I just spend a whole lot of time sitting down. I'm just becoming this blob, and I've lost all of my strength because I'm not running up and down the stairs anymore. But they also tell me that walking is as good. So going for a walk around the block, it's okay. You don't have to like jog or do push-ups or anything. Going for a walk counts. Cutting out the dietary extremes: sugar, caffeine, alcohol, preservatives. It's very hard to stay happy when you're really hungry, when you're having a sugar crash, when you're having a carbs coma, when you have a drink to calm down. That's like that salt water, isn't it? You do calm down temporarily at first, and then you're more wired later. And I found this because, you know, for many years I drank way too much as alcoholic. And so I could drink myself to sleep, but I couldn't stay asleep. So I didn't think that was the problem. I didn't think alcohol was the problem. But what happened was alcohol would put me to sleep. And then within 3 hours, I would wake up and I'd be wired and I couldn't get to sleep again. So that was driven by the disturbing emotions, but the actual self-medicating with alcohol meant I couldn't get better. So a really simple thing: cut out those dietary extremes, stop poisoning yourself. Another one for anxiety is to mimic a posture of well-being. So if you want to feel confident, stand up straight, put your shoulders back, put a nice smile on your face. So that's how I learned at first. I thought, well, how do people lead classes? How do people welcome people into a Dharma center when I'm shy? Like, you know, on the Myers-Briggs typology, I'm an introvert. How would you know? Because I started mimicking my best friend Pearlie, who's an extrovert. How do I do this? I know, I'll just pretend I'm Pearlie. What does she do? Well, you know, she has this body language and she has a big smile. And when my mother was alive and running this center, she'd welcome everyone with a big smile and come in and have a tea and a biscuit. So I just started doing that, doing what they did, and mimicking a person who was welcoming and confident. And then it became natural, and then it genuine. So you don't have to kind of have that imposter syndrome of, oh maybe I'm just pretending to be relaxed and confident. You practice it. So mimicking it is practicing it. So one of the best things to do is to sit in a relaxed posture. Not all tight like this, makes it worse and worse. Just sit in a relaxed posture, and then it helps the rest flow. These are all kind of like neurological body hacks, aren't they? The psychological one, do it for others. Doing it for yourself, it just won't be enough. It just won't do it. But you can do it for others, and I think I'm doing it for my people, for everybody else who's terrified, for everybody else who's an introvert and forced out into the world, for everybody else that is lonely, for everybody else that is on a spiritual journey and doesn't know where to do or what to read or where do I get started on this. My people. You are my people. So, you know, you think of others as your people and you start there. Everybody else that's come to another country, you know, not being able to speak the language, they're your people. You do it for them. And now suddenly you have the strength of the group. You have a huge incentive. You have something to share. And, you know, one person's suffering isn't much compared to everybody else's. So it really helps. And a great one, reframe your anxiety as anticipation. So this is what all my performing friends say when they're scared, anxious before a performance, they reframe it in their mind. And again, my friend Pearlie said, you know, when she was about to do a show at QPAC and she was nervous, and one of the musicians there, the main musician, the composer, it's like, how come you're always so excited and happy about these things? Don't you ever get nervous? And he said, yeah, I used to get nervous, but then I just tell myself, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it. And actually, neurologically, there is no difference between anxiety and anticipation. Neurologically, exactly the same thing is happening in the brain. The same neurons, blah, 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 whatever's happening, exactly the same. If you did a fMRI scan, you couldn't tell the difference. So why do we feel such a big difference between anxiety and anticipation? Because of how we name it, how we frame it. So you can trick yourself by going, I'm not scared, I'm excited. Part of the homework will be everything that you habitually worry about, stress, mull over, wind yourself up about, write a list. Write them down. Write down each one, because that way you put it in its box. And then you write down one thing you can do about each of those things. So even something as terrifying as climate change, there's one thing we can do about it. We can write an email, we can sign a petition, we can donate to a fund. There's always something we can do. And that gives us back our sense of agency again, because we can do something about it. And the main thing, to deal with the root cause, those drivers of the disturbing emotions, to stop seeking satisfaction from external conditions. The dissatisfied mind is the main cause of stress, not the job. It's the dissatisfied mind that causes stress. So if we want less stress, less anxiety, we've got to stop looking for those external things and find it within. So that's why we kind of looked at attachment last week, because anxiety is the result of attachment. All right, so I have a little story to tell you, the last few minutes or so. Finding the wisdom in anxiety. So here's an example that we can have, how to listen to your anxiety. Instead of trying to, number one, oh, that's right. So let's start at this. Here's a picture of a plane. This is actually not doctored. This is from St. Martin's. It's one of the world's most hair-raising airports. So many people have a fear of flying. And if you have a fear of flying, people might say, oh, you know, don't worry, it'll be okay. Nothing to worry about. Statistically, it's, you know, more likely that you'll die in a car than in a plane, but it doesn't necessarily change how we feel, does it? Or whatever it is that we are anxious about. So instead of trying to get rid of the anxiety, actually what we're doing, we're missing a trick here. Because it is true, it's much more likely to die on the road than in a plane. But we don't actually value that. We don't recognize that we're not ready to die until something unusual like this comes about, like being on a plane. So actually the thing isn't to get rid of the anxiety, to say everything will be okay. The thing is to recognize this anxiety is showing me something, and it's showing me I am not ready to die. I'm not ready. So this is a good thing to know, because If we're not confronted with this, we're just going to go along, la, 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 and then something untoward happens and we are not prepared. So it's better to know. So when this anxiety comes up, the fear of flying, instead of trying to get rid of the anxiety, sit with it. Sit with that fear, with that anxiety, the fear of flying, and ask questions. What is that fear saying? What's it telling me? What part is true? What part is just wildly exaggerated? What is my wisdom reminding me about? So anxiety actually is our wisdom trying to burst forth. And what our anxiety shows us is we have regrets. There are things left undone. There are people we need to apologize to. There are things on our bucket list that we've been distracted with stupid things, and we should have done those bucket list things. We're not ready. And now is a great time to know, not later on, just before we do actually die. So just trying to get rid of the anxiety means we never even recognize this, and then we waste our life. And then we get to the end of our life, and then we're riven with regret and unhappiness. So how to actually be able to face our death without fear, without regrets, is to look at that anxiety now. And it's very difficult to bring that anxiety up because we cannot comprehend that we're going to die until something happens to us and we have a near-death experience. We're in a car crash and we're not killed. Or we get on a plane and suddenly we're overwhelmed with anxiety. So this is like our opportunity. So the fearlessness comes from actually acknowledging our fragility, acknowledging how we're spending our life, not saying, the fearlessness doesn't come from saying, you'll be fine, it'll be okay, don't be silly. That's rubbish. And it's quite condescending to someone going through a huge response like this. But fearlessness comes from recognizing our human situation, that we don't know when we're going to die, and that matters. So actually, what our anxiety can tell us, we don't just say, it'll be okay, nothing to worry about. There is potentially things to worry about. But what we can say is, whatever happens, know you are loved, that your life matters. So the only way we have a real experience of that is through these stressful situations. Now, it's quite big, isn't it? You're probably the only place that you'll get to where it says the fear of flying is a good thing. But I wanted to run the poll. Let's see. I have a poll. And I'm going to launch the polling. Actually, I might just stop the screen share too, I'm not sure. So hopefully you can see the poll. And if you can't, I'm just going to read it out to you and then pick which one. So out of all the four main misconceptions about the nature of things that's caused you the most suffering, which one is it? So 1, I forget that things will change. People, relationships, my job, my body is constantly changing moment by moment, and every now and again changes quite dramatically, and then I get a shock. 2, I expect things to bring lasting happiness, and I'm surprised, hurt, betrayed when along with them they bring worry, anxiety, dissatisfaction, boredom, disappointment. Maybe I just need a bigger, better one. 3, I expect things to be perfect. I don't even recognize I have expectations until the person reveals their faults, the object reveals its drawbacks, the damn thing just doesn't work. Or 4, I'm sure there's a real me, but whenever I try to find it, I'm not there. I identify as my body, my faults, my status or lack of it, my job or lack of it, but the question remains, who am I really? So for different misconceptions that we have that really influence us, don't they? Let's see. 6 out of 7 people have voted. Give you a little bit more time to think about it. Just a way of doing a bit of a review. And hopefully with these misconceptions too, you can see that it's just because we don't know. We don't know how to negotiate our way out of this. We don't know what to do. That goes back to that fundamental ignorance too, isn't it? It's not that we're bad ignorant. It's just that we don't know. And so this kind of self-education is so incredibly important, really helps us. And one of those main things being that, you know, anxiety and fear, they really have so much wisdom in there. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling and share the results. So the winner, we forget impermanence, that things will change, and we expect things to be perfect. Yep. So they're the two biggies, but I mean all of them, as long as you can really recognize. But you can see it's hard to choose, isn't it? Because we're all the same in this. We all labor under these same misconceptions. So thank you for contributing to the poll. I'll just go through the final summary and the homework. Anxiety mostly is a habit. And we practice that habit and then it becomes part of us. It feels like it's part of us, but it isn't. It's mostly habit, thank goodness. And it can change. Thank goodness for change. It's driven mostly by afflictive emotions and mostly by attachment. Our anxiety, what can it reveal to us? It's like the seed of wisdom. We're not living a life true to ourselves. Why do we get anxious? Because our impermanence is becoming apparent to us and we're not ready. So how much better to know that now? We're kind of out of step with reality. We think we're going to live forever, and it's only those things that make us anxious that reveal this truth to us. So the Buddhist approach is great because it shows that actually not just anxiety, but any form of problem is the growing pains, like that seed, our seed of wisdom trying to burst forth and get our attention. So anxiety is a good messenger. Don't worry that it's difficult at first. There's the wisdom all the way to enlightenment in there. Freedom and enlightenment. So the homework, self-reflection sheets, there's one on the anxiety. There's also a really nice meditation on impermanence. Not to freak you out, but to get you gently used to it, to become aware of this natural process of change and become comfortable with it. And a nice analytical meditation as well. So they're there in the notes. TV homework. A really good one is the SBS show 24 Hours in Emergency. It's so moving. It's also incredibly revealing in a wonderful way. Just the magnificence of ordinary human beings. Also air traffic investigations and I Shouldn't Be Alive. So I Shouldn't Be Alive is one of those disaster ones where people actually live through those disasters and have this profound change in their life. They're all really inspiring and fascinating. And next week, antidotes to anger. How to stay calm in difficult situations. So the antidotes to anger is patience, and patience is the cure for all problems. It's the one that we can start to deal with our disturbing emotions with. So it's kind of got a natural progression there. Let's dedicate the merits. Thank you so much for coming today and for having the courage to look at these issues and to actually see how there could be some incredible wisdom in your experiences of anxiety and depression. And we can dedicate that we can really relish whatever problems come along, that we can have courage, we can find how we can benefit and where the wisdom is in there. And that way we can use everything that happens to us, pleasant, unpleasant, good or bad. It can all contribute to our lasting happiness and contribute to the happiness and peace and harmony of everyone around us. So all the very best. Thank you so much. I hope to see you next week. Bye.